Serious. What was the scariest? We need to leave. Now, gut feeling, that you've ever experienced? Part 2. I was camping in eastern Arizona with a friend of mine. We like to hike in this particular area, that's fairly isolated. We found a place, probably 14 or 15 miles deep into the forest on small quad or bike trails, and set up camp for the night. We put out our fire and go into our tents. Probably about 15 minutes go by. I'm reading a book on my phone, and what can I only describe as a roar sounds like it's about 50 feet away from our campsite. Never in my life have I been so terrified. I had immediate goosebumps, and went into full panic mode. My friend and I both get out of our tents, look around, and don't see anything because it's dark as hell, but run as fast as we can, and just hop in the car. Immediately drove off, and found a motel about an hour drive away. I will never forget that sound. I've seen bears in real life, and looked up what a bear roar sounds like, and it was nothing like it. The one we heard was almost high-pitched, and just filled me with immediate dread. No clue to this day what it was, but I am glad we noped the F out of there. We came back the next day and everything was as we left it, other than the coals in the fire were spread around a bit. There was no wind that night, so I don't know what happened. I haven't gone back to that area since, and I have no desire to. Whatever made that noise, definitely didn't want us there. When I was a teenager, me and some friends were hanging out around midnight. A caravan drives past slowly, with a few people looking out the windows. We all look at each other quiet, and the caravan pulls into a nearby parking space. We all get up and walk to our bikes, because something feels really off. A few minutes later, we hear someone shout, and as I turned around, there was about 5 or 6 people getting out, with metal pipes and other things in hands. We ran so fast, nothing happened, but I'm 99% sure we were about to get beaten and robbed. Years ago, when I was still living at home with the parents, I drove home around 2 a.m. As I parked my car, I noticed a man walking down the street. I decided to wait until he passed my car, and was far enough for me to get out. However, instead he passed my car, and hid behind the van that was directly parked behind me. I guess he did not think I was paying attention to him. So, I called my dad, who was asleep, to come down and get me. He did, and when the guy saw my dad, he immediately ran away. I was lucky. I was walking down the street, in a very unfamiliar city, with a group of friends. I got this feeling, and didn't know how to articulate it, so I said to the group, "Hey, I've gotta use the restroom, can we just duck inside the subway, real quick? I promise, I'll be quick." About a minute later, there was a shootout just up the block. If we wouldn't have gone into the restaurant, we would have all been standing right in the middle of the incident, waiting to cross the street. A friend called me, and said, "There's a wildfire, 8 miles away. Can you help me move my horses?" So, I drove down. She was wrong, it's 8 miles by car. Under 2, as the crow flies. We got the first set of horses out and down to another farm. The second set, I'm working on, and suddenly, things get quiet. It's as if the world stopped for a minute. I look at the horse, and the horse looks like it's ready to run. I take a deep breath, and suddenly, the noise comes back, the wind is hot AF. And the light changes. I told Sherry, the girl I'm helping, we gotta go now. No time to shove the horses into the trailer, they are smart enough to survive, and I let them loose. We run to the truck, and the barn is already on fire. Then, we get in the truck and notice the fire past us and is blocking the road. So, we jump out and ran to a small pond for the horses. And we dive in, hoping the fire doesn't burn us. It was about 20 minutes of hell. It might have been longer, I don't know. It was insanely scary, hot and loud. We got rescued by the fire department's water-dropping helicopter. It landed in the field, and pulled us in. We got lucky. The truck was burned to the frame. And the horse Sherry let go, died. The one I let go survived, but was burned. That's most likely the scariest moment. I was an infantry platoon leader in Afghanistan. One night, we were on a foot patrol along the outskirts of a town, where we were concerned about Taliban activity. I decided to move in closer, to get a look at the place, without worrying about the people of the town coming and going, which is always stressful. It was about 3 a.m., so, everyone was asleep, it was completely silent. My interpreter carried an FM radio, that he used to monitor non-secure traffic, which is how the Taliban tended to communicate back then. We hear something in Pashto on his radio, and he very calmly turns to me and says, "Sir, they are saying The ambush is set. I immediately got on my radio, and told my squad leaders to halt, and we pulled back, and got the hell out of Dodge. That was probably the most pucker I have felt in combat. I am convinced that Interpreter saved several lives that night, and when he messaged me, during the fall of Kabul, asking if I could get his family out, I called every contact I could think of, to make sure he got on a flight. They currently live in Seattle, where he works in IT. A shady-looking guy told me to come here when I was waiting for my mom under the apartment building. I was about 10. I ran upstairs immediately, without looking back. Looking back, as a 25-year-old, I couldn't imagine why any normal adult would need to speak to a random 10-year-old, unless the kid looks lost, or is doing something dangerous. Glad I bolted. About a year and a half ago, I got out of a concert hall, and I was with my FWB, her friend, and her friend's BF. We walked across the busy street to a bar, 2:30 a.m. around this time. Got a quick tequila shot and a drink, to end the night, and we left to call the Uber. We were sitting on the side of the road, on a curb, waiting for the Uber, and there was a group of people that walked to our side. They just looked like bad effing news and they were just looking to cause problems. I look at my FWB and pulled her up. She looks at me, like, WTF, at first, and then she saw the we need to GTFO look in my eyes, so she turned around, and said, "We are going to the other two." Once we got up, not 5 seconds later, bang, 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 and I felt like I got a painful splinter in the back of my leg, but we ran to the cop car, across the street, to get some cover. Turns out, I got a fragment of the curb that we were sitting on, where the bullet hit exactly where we were sitting in my calf. It was a wild shot, that just happened to hit where we were sitting. Unfortunately, someone died that night, and my gut feeling saved my friends or myself from a fatal gunshot that wasn't even intended for us. The only reason I knew about a piece of stone embedded in my leg, and it wasn't just a muscle pull from running, was because a cop responding and running by us, while we were standing behind the cop car, and he saw blood on my leg, and thought I got shot. A quick statement and ER visit, to fish out the half marble-sized shard of stone in my calf, while absolutely wasted, and I was on my way home at 6 a.m. I didn't really put it all together, until I got home thinking, holy shit, I can't believe I'm alive right now. My ex had been planning to have me killed, and make it look like a home invasion. His behavior had shifted, in a very odd way, the week before. I found out later, he had a woman pregnant behind my back, and had planned to move her in, and ship my kids off to the state. Their dad is already dead. He wanted to collect my life insurance. I got up right after he left for work, that early morning, got dressed in the first things I could grab, woke up my kids, and told them, we just had to go. I told them, not to ask questions right then, that we just had to leave. The door that led from our garage, to the inside of our house, was always religiously locked. That night, it had been left unlocked. In the weeks leading up to this, our security alarm had been bypassed, and he tried to blame my oldest son, when my son didn't even know how to do that kind of thing. My husband taught someone else how to do it. My wife and I used to live in rural exurb, outside a large metropolitan area. We were on an interstate, about halfway between the city and our home, when my wife, who was 6 months pregnant, started having contractions. At the next off-ramp, I turned around, and headed back towards the city, planning on heading for an ER. I took the very first exit on the outskirts of the city. It was pretty desolate. The only thing on the two-lane road were a couple of rock quarries that were empty after dark. There wasn't much light on the winter darkened evening. I pulled into a gravel turnout, just south of the off-ramp, pulled to a stop, leaving the engine running, and turned my full attention to my wife. A few minutes passed before my attention was grabbed by a car parked across the turnout turning their headlights on with high beams. My wife grabbed my arm and said, "We've got to get out of here." And I was like, yeah, so I dropped it in gear and hauled ass down that two-lane road towards the city. The other car gave chase for a while, but I was flooring my car. I drove a Dodge Stratus. Eventually, we got into civilization and the other car turned around and effed off. We spent the night in the hospital, narrowly avoiding the premature birth of my son. He's 17 now. We guessed, I didn't notice, that my headlights were shining on a drug handoff, my attention being on my wife, and it pissed the other people off. But who knows, crazies are everywhere. I've had a few over the years. Rememberable ones are when in the woods, with my 1-year-old, picking up pine cones. It was about 4 p.m. on a summer's day, so, still light and warm. Anyway, suddenly this mixed feeling of dread and fear, and of being watched came over me. I just picked him up and ran. The next day, on our local community Facebook group, another mother reported that her and her 2 little girls had been flashed in the woods and quite aggressively. Another one was, I was heavily pregnant, I'd went to a hen do just for the meal and then was going home. I was about to call a taxi, when the bride insisted the limo she hired dropped me home. I thought it was a funny idea, for my husband to see me get home in a limo, so, I agreed. The driver seemed fine with it, and was a nice chatty guy. We're driving home, when suddenly he starts detouring. We're by the docks, and he starts pulling into some dodgy-ass car park. Not saying a word to me. I called my husband right away, and very loudly told him the situation, and where I was, and that I'd be home in 10 minutes. The driver made some excuse, about picking something up from a friend, disappeared for 5 minutes, and then took me home. I'm convinced he had bad intentions, and to this day, the regret and pure fear, and feeling effing stupid, will never ever leave me. Ladies, we are never safe. Never presume you are. We were driving back from an impromptu family vacation. My husband and I were both driving cars, too many people, not enough alert drivers, and I was following him. We were in the left lane, passing a truck, and I suddenly had an overwhelming feeling that we needed to slow way down and move over immediately. I called him and told him that we needed to get over, go slower than the truck, and turn our hazards on. He thought I was a little crazy, but he's learned to listen to my gut feelings, and did it. Suddenly, we ran into a freak ice storm, and the truck slipped off the road. The car that went past us on the left slid into oncoming traffic, and 3 other cars behind us proceeded to slide off the road. There was a big dip on the side of the road, and one of the cars even tipped over. We somehow came through unscathed, and made it home safely. Another time, I was driving to work, and I was behind a work van with ladders on top of it. It wasn't particularly busy on the highway, but someone was behind me somewhat close. I had a horrible feeling wash over me, that I needed to move over right away. I moved 1 lane over, about 15 seconds, before one of the ladders flew off the van. It hit the road right next to me, and the car that was behind me ran over it a little, but luckily wasn't impaled or anything. I've had this feeling several times in my life, and have even cancelled entire vacations over it. I don't know if anything would have happened for several of them, but I truly think I've avoided some serious trouble. When I was a kid, the neighbor across the street offered me a ride to school when he saw me walking, and said he'd give me candy too. It felt off, so I just said, no thanks, and kept walking, thinking nothing of it. Maybe a year later, he shot and killed his wife, and then himself. I was walking on the beach with my partner, in a country with a pretty high crime rate, and a shady-ass dude, with one of the scariest facial expressions I've ever seen, started to follow us, for almost 10 minutes, and as soon as I saw a bus full of tourists, we jumped right on it. For sure, that dude was either rob or kidnap us. My great-grandma lives at the far end of a neighborhood, right next to a big, busy street, so there are suspicious characters by her house often. When I was a kid, I visited her every weekend, and one time, when I was 11, I was sitting on the living room floor, and I heard these 2 people arguing in Spanish. I hear a lady screaming at the top of her lungs, and having gone to Arizonan schools all my life, I recognize every cuss word. Curious, I went to the kitchen, and peeked through the window, which looked out onto the street, and something didn't seem right. I felt like I should duck, and the moment I did, the lady pulls a gun out, and starts shooting. The man she was arguing with was out of my view, so I didn't know what happened to him, but I was the only witness to that crime. I was supposed to get off of my retail job at 10 p.m., and catch the first bus I needed to get home. My manager had me stay later, so I had to catch a late bus and change my route, since my usual second bus stopped running. I did notice this late bus ride was empty, but the 10 p.m. one was usually pretty full. The stop wasn't my usual spot, so I just sat to wait for the bus. I was texting my best friend, and asking her to pick me up, because sometimes buses don't show or are late. She wasn't answering me, since she ended up working late too. And then I noticed my surroundings. I was just off of a main street, just south of several closed corner stores. I realized this bus bench was on the street nearest to a park that closes at sundown. There were no cars and no people. The street light near the bus stop was busted too. I immediately felt unnerved and trapped. Nothing was open and nothing was nearby. A man was walking towards the bench I was waiting on. He was walking from the park. He would pass under a street lamp and be illuminated, and then disappear before being lit up by the light again. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. He came up behind the bench, and didn't sit down next to me, just stood behind the bench, slightly to my right. Then, he started walking around the bench, just circling me. I called my friend and acted like she had answered, but instead I left a voicemail. "Hey, you almost here?" "Yep, I'm still here. I'll hop in as soon as you pull up. Wanna grab food?" "Nah, we had McDonald's last week." The dude kept circling me. I was too afraid to even look at his face. I hung up, and put my phone away, and realized I had my box cutter in my bag. I pulled it out, and started playing with it, just pushing the blade in and out. He stopped circling me, and I finally looked at him and stood up. He turned north and walked away. My friend pulled up soon after. We drove right past the guy, who was still walking aimlessly. I bought a car, about a week later, and I always drove my co-workers home, if we worked late together, and they needed a ride. In Iraq, around 2006. Was on a foot patrol, through a muddy area, along the Euphrates River. Myself and my team were walking down this pathway, in a somewhat open field along the river, and I looked to my left, and see a 55-gallon drum laid on its side, and I noticed that we were about to walk parallel to it. I then looked down a bit, to my front right, and saw a very soft glow coming from the dirt. It was dusk at this point. I turned to my team, and say, "I think we need to turn around," and as we start walking away, a big-ass explosion goes from under my feet, and launches me through the air. A gunfight ensues, as the remaining teammates start shooting back, and I regain my scruples to return fire. After a short while, we contain the scene and a look at the crater. The bomb left a crater that was about 8 feet wide and 5 feet deep. The bomb crew people said it was buried too deep, and probably why it didn't kill me. The drum on its side was a marking object, so the trigger guy could line us up with the explosive from a distance. The glow I saw was the dusk sunlight glinting off a buried wire that was connected to the bomb. None of my team died or was injured. We turned around just in time. In 2012, I drove across the country, from Philly to LA, with a good friend of mine. I'm a big guy, she's a smaller woman, just for context. We camped the whole way out. The plan was to get to LA, drop her off at her new apartment, and then I'd fly home. She couldn't get into her apartment until Wednesday morning, and we arrived outside of LA on Tuesday evening. We didn't have money for hotels or anything, so we camped in Angeles National Forest. No idea why, but I had a weird feeling being this close to a major city and camping. Felt like a bad vibe. But we got there and set up before dark, and ate dinner. My friend asked, "If you could see any animal tonight, what would you want to see?" And I swear, I said, "Not a person." When we arrived there was only one other campsite set up at the campground, and they were around the bend from us. We saw the guy who was camping there. Anyway, we go to sleep. At some point it's dark, and I wake up. There's a flashlight shining around our tent. I figure it's just another campsite that arrived after we fell asleep. Then I hear, clear as day, a man's voice right outside the door of my tent say, "Who's in there? Who's in that tent?" My friend woke up and said, "Hello?" So, it wasn't just me that heard it. We both said hello? "Who is that?" But got no response. Didn't really hear anyone, walked away. Didn't see a flashlight. I freaked the F out. Why the hell would someone knock on our tent in the middle of the night? I grabbed my headlamp and my knife, and I zipped open the tent and jumped out really fast, in case he was waiting to bonk me on the head. But no one was there. I looked everywhere and there was no one. No other campsite. My friend said, we should just go back to sleep, but I was too scared. It was 4 a.m. and raining, and I told her, we needed to leave right effing now. She said, I was scaring her, and I said, good. And we threw everything in the car, all wet and crumpled up, and started to leave. On the way out, on the road in the campsite, we saw what I presumed was the guy. He wasn't the other guy from the other campsite, just some random guy, walking back towards our site. I cracked the window as we passed him, and said, dude, what the F, and all he said was, sorry for freaking you guys out, and kept walking back towards where we had camped. We booked it the F out of there and drove straight to Santa Monica, because we had no idea what else to do. I have no effing idea why he did that, but it scared the ever-living piss out of me. Still haven't camped in Angeles since then, but I'm actually going again this summer. I exited a metro station, about 2 decades ago, and the parking lot had a small area behind bushes, where I parked. As I headed into the parking lot, I saw 2 guys, standing between a row of cars, which looked out of place. They were watching me, to see where I was going. I decided to walk right toward them, and they moved off some, then I walked to my car, and drove away. I glanced back, to see them, heading back for the bushy spot. They killed a woman shortly thereafter, who was parked in that bushy area. Walking toward them probably saved you. With a lot of predators, including humans, when they expect you to flee, or be afraid, but you're not, it makes them not see you as prey, and back down. The feeling, not a thought, because it's just instinct, is basically, she should be afraid, but she's not, that's an unknown, and that's dangerous, I'll pick an easier target. Wouldn't recommend anyone trying that intentionally, unless you have no choice. With any predator, including humans, you could just as easily be perceived as a threat that needs to be attacked. Picture it, 1994. I was 18, and waitressing in a sports bar. A comedy club was upstairs. One night, a comedian kept visiting between sets. He was funny and charming, and he seemed quite smitten with me. He asked me out to late-night breakfast. If you've ever been in hospitality, you know we go out and eat at 3 a.m. I changed after my shift, and waited a few minutes for him. I realized, I really didn't know this person, and I should not let him in my car. I decided to be smart and GTFO. A few years later, I was absent-mindedly flipping through a People magazine, at a friend's house. That is when I saw my comedian date, Vince Champ, had been arrested, as a serialerist. His favorite target was young college girls, and they finally caught him, after putting the puzzle together between victims, and his campus circuit. Holy shit, I dodged a bullet. I think, he may still be in jail, he was that terrible. I had a 9-month-old baby at home, and didn't go out much, and one of my friends was in from out of town, and asked if I wanted to see a band, whose members were people I knew socially from college. I said, sure, that will be fun. I met her, and a bunch of people at a bar, across the street, before the show, and had a nice time, but got a feeling that I should go home. My husband was at home with our baby, and wanted me to have fun, and I was, but I had a bad feeling to just leave. I said my goodbyes, and left. There was a shooting at the bar that night. No one I knew was hurt, but they were locked in the bar, for hours, and it was terrifying for them. I'm glad I trusted my instincts. When I was a kid, an adult patted my head, and I developed an instant inexplicable loathing for him, and refused to be alone with him. My parents told me I was being ridiculous, and forced me to be around him. He was later sent to prison for abuse of a girl. Similar thing happened to me. My mom's best friend got a new boyfriend, and I immediately hated the guy. Mom asked what I thought of him. I said, I thought he was Satan. I was 5, and learning how to read the picture Bible, so that was my only frame of reference to describe evil. Months after this, Mom gets a panicked call from her friend in the middle of the night. She'd come home from work to find the boyfriend passed out in the bathroom with a needle in his arm. When she tried rousing him, he strangled her unconscious. Shortly after this, he kidnapped her and her children at gunpoint, and drove them across state lines. Sadly, it was the start of a long, abusive relationship.